Thank you very much for this kind invitation. And I'm really sorry that I'm not with you in person. I actually have currently got COVID, so I'm sorry it's having these long effects. Um, I'm going to talk to you about brains, and I want to start by taking a journey back in time. So this is true for all of us. If you look at a photograph of yourself as a baby, as a very young person, you're seeing somebody who's not there anymore. And I'm not talking metaphorically. I mean, literally, the cycle of life and death in the body means that if I look at this picture of me, I'm the little girl on the left, very pleased to be holding my two favorite soft toys. Um, that little girl isn't there anymore. I don't mean it metaphorically because now she's a woman, now she's a scientist. I mean, literally, her body has changed. You have a cycle of life and death in the body. Some cells cycle very quickly. So the cells in the lining of your mouth and your gut, they are renewed every 2 to 3 days because they are wearing out very, very quickly. Your skin is renewing about every 30 days. Your red blood cells renewing about every 4 months. Your bone is dynamic tissue and you get a whole new skeleton around every 10 years. So I'm looking at somebody who has a completely different body to me. But there are some really important exceptions. There are some cells in the body that never renew. You are born with them and then they are with you for the whole rest of your life. And those cells are, if you are born female, the oocytes, the female gametes. They are the cells in the crystalline lens in your eye. They are the cells in the hair cells in your ear, and those are the cells that turn the physical vibrations of sound into an electrical signal that your brain can interpret. And they are the cells in your brain, the neurons. So when I look at that little girl, I'm seeing somebody with every single part of my body is different, except for the cells in my eyes that I'm using to look at the camera, the cells in my ears that are turning sound into an electrical signal so I can hear what my dad's saying that's making me laugh, and her brain. So this is quite extraordinary when you think about brains. You are born with almost all the brain cells you will ever have. And this means a lot, actually, for how we think about brains. First of all, we need to think about what those brain cells are and why they are so unusual. They're unusual because they have this lifelong profile, and they're also unusual because of their shape. This is an image of a neuron, a brain cell, and what you can see is that it has a cell body sitting there in the middle. But something that's very unusual about this, all cells have a cell body, is you get these very fine projections coming off the cell body. And those are the ways that the neuron connects to and talks with other brain cells. And you can see little sprinkles, little sort of little buttons coming off those projections. And those are actually the synapses with which your brain cells can make connections to other brain cells. So the significance of these long projections is that your brain cells can be making connections with brain cells that are some distance away from them or very close up. And the significance of those little synapses, those little buttons, there are things that can grow and develop. So your brain can form new connections with the brain cells that surrounds it. So when this scales up, and you've got about 86 billion of these brain cells, what you have is an incredibly complex biological computational structure, which is not learning and changing by growing new bits of the brain in general. It's growing and learning by making and forming new connections and strengthening or losing existing connections. And that's how change happens in your brain in terms of how you learn and experience things. It's also important to bear in mind that if we actually look at this in vivo in the brain itself, those neurons aren't standing like trees in a forest with space around them. They are densely embedded in the neural tissue. And that's partly because, of course, they're intermixing with all those other brain cells, but also because neurons are highly complex cells. They require a great deal of support. So you have a huge number of the cells actually inside your brain aren't neurons, they are support cells like glial cells, which are surrounding and supporting and helping the function of the brain cells. So if you take a zoom through brain structure, well, that's what actually this is work from Jeff Lichtman's lab, where they are putting together sequential individual slices of brain which have been imaged with an electron microscope. So we're really zooming in onto the substructure of brain cells. This is traveling through a reconstruction of those. So this is as if you are traveling through a bit of brain cortex. And you can see incredible detail here. Every so often you might see something with lots of little sprinkles in, lots of little dots. Those are actually individual synapses, those connections between brain cells. And those little dots that you're seeing, those are little bubbles of neurotransmitter ready to be fired to transmit information to another brain cell when that brain cell itself is activated. So the scale here is amazing. And I have to say, in terms of the work that they're doing in this lab, they're not just making these images, they are then digitizing these images and able to track individual brain cells that move through this structure and actually look at their connectivity. And I think of the future, a great deal of what we're going to learn about brains is going to be go from this cellular level up to the kind of structural level that I've been talking about. Of course, that brain that we're born with, it changes a great deal as we grow. So here we've got the brain of a newborn human. Newborn humans have big brains, but that brain then grows very quickly. So between birth and about the age of 6, your brain roughly quadruples in size. So it's approaching an adult size by the time you're 6 years old. And then it continues to grow. And remember, it's not growing by growing new brain cells. Those brain cells themselves are getting bigger and they are forming different sorts of connections. There's a complex profile of how connections grow and fade and grow again inside the developing brain. But also, those brain cells, those long projections, get myelinated, and myelinating those long projections makes them work more efficiently. And actually, the process of myelination is something that carries on throughout your childhood and on through adolescent period, along with this growth of the brain. In fact, it's not until you're in your 20s that you start to see what looks like an adult profile of human brain structure. If we look at this in an animated format, this is just showing in teenagers how their brains are progressing towards a more adult profile. The areas in blue are the areas that are showing the more adult profile. And there's a very roughly back to front direction here, such that on the whole, it's the brain areas towards the front of the brain that are amongst the last to actually show this fully adult profile. And interestingly, those are the 8 brain areas associated with complex decision making and sort of metacognition, thinking about thinking. And that might be why one of the aspects, and respect to all teenagers, but I remember being a teenager, I wasn't always great at making decisions about my life. And that's probably because my brain was still growing, as all of our brains are at this age. And then when we get to quotes the adult brain, we're not looking at a finished brain. What we're looking at here is something that continues to be a work in progress, because the adult brain that you have is reflecting not just the growth of your brain through childhood and adolescence, but also the things that you have learned, the things that you have, the experiences that you've had. Anything you learn to do will change your brain. Anything you remember from today will because your brain has changed, and it's changing by making new connections and strengthening existing connections. And that's a continuing process. The brain is not finished. If you really want to look at the brain showing something, a different profile, you learn big things. So learning to read really changes your brain. Learning to play a musical instrument changes your brain. Learning to speak multiple languages will change your brain. And if you think about this, we've got one brain and we have one lifetime in which to make the most of it. It's interesting to think about the things that we can do to support this. So we're realizing that experience is changing the brain and that continues over our whole lifespan. Well, what are the things that we can do to actually keep that brain working in its best way? Well, the first example is counterintuitive, and that is to get your hearing tested. This is because there's now very good data showing that the single biggest preventable risk factor for dementia is losing your hearing in adulthood and not having that hearing restored by something like a hearing aid. So if you get your hearing tested, if you're at all worried about your hearing, and everybody over the age of 40 will show some decline in hearing because there are moving parts in your ear and those moving parts can wear out, get your hearing tested. And if you get a hearing aid fitted, use that hearing aid. It sounds counterintuitive, but you need to learn to use a hearing aid. You need to get used to it. It's not like putting on glasses and the world looks clearer. They are something your brain has to adapt to. But there is very good evidence that this will give your brain tremendous protection against dementia. And that's because hearing loss that's not treated is very serious in how it affects your ability to communicate with other people and to have social interactions with other people and to get involved in the world outside. And what you tend to see is that people withdraw because they have difficulties understanding what's being said and they withdraw from social interactions. And this itself is bad for the brain. Our brains are social brains. They don't exist in the world on their own. Everything, a great deal of what your brain is learning through development, it's learning in interactions with other people, and that continues throughout your entire adult life. Your brain wants that social contact. A lack of social contact is bad for your brain. We know that the size and the strength of your social networks is a very good predictor both of your physical and your mental health. And this seems to have its basis again in why losing your hearing is bad for the brain, because it's removing the brain from this opportunity to have this opportunity to continue the social connections and to continue letting the brain work in the social environment which it craves. And this really does matter. This is a lovely paper by Robin Dunbar. I recommend you go and read, showing that it's not just the social network, but it can wholly build into your experience of happiness and life satisfaction that has its roots in these social interactions. Another extremely important role for brain protection is exercise. I'm sure you're all extremely bored of people telling you that exercise is good for you, but it's really important when we think about brains. Your brain is only about 1% of your body weight, but it uses about 20% of the circulating oxygen in your blood, because it uses a huge amount of energy to have all those neurons ready to fire. It's an expensive bit of kit. This means that anything you can do to improve your cardiovascular health will improve and protect your brain against damage. So this is definitely worth taking seriously. I think of exercise as a neurohack that is giving my brain tremendous protection against, for example, problems to the cardiovascular system that would have large knock-on effects on how well my brain is working. It's also really important to have a little bit of humility when we think about brains. We aren't the only animals with interesting brains. There are a range of very interesting brains, for example, in mammals. And it's interesting to think about how that relates to things like intelligence. If you look at the human brain and the elephant brain, elephants also have very big brains, but they're not just sort of scaled up versions of human brains. And there is an argument that says that actually primates like us and gorillas and chimpanzees and macaques have developed a form of intelligence that's very driven by the fact that we can interact with the world with our hands in order to find small amounts of high quality food that we want. So things like fruit and nuts, that's driven intelligent behavior in primates. Intelligent behavior in elephants looks very different. Elephants have a much, much better social understanding of the world than us. They can be familiar with many more elephants than we can be familiar with other humans. And they remember those other elephants. And if they don't like those other elephants, they will remember and they will respond decades after an interaction with an elephant that went badly. An elephant will remember a grudge that it bears and it will act on it, and it will make all the other elephants act on it as well. So the argument here is that elephants have an unbelievably complex social world, and they don't have an intelligence that needs to focus in on sort of finding food because they're standing on their food. They also have a very good understanding of the spatial layout of the world, because what is limited for them is water. And there are examples of elephants remembering the location of water, again, over decades, and also associated with weather changes that might mean certain sources might or might not be available. So their understanding of the spatial and social world far outstrips ours. Here's another brain. This is the brain of a C. elegans worm. It's a very small worm, and it has the distinction of being the first worm, or the first any kind of animal, to have its entire brain mapped out. So its entire brain neural system. So what you see is that it's got 302 neurons. Most of them are clustered up in a little brain-like structure up at the head end. But it's also got something that looks like a spine and something else going on at the other end of its body. The really interesting thing is what this animal can do with just 302 brain cells. They can learn from experience, they can be trained. And in fact, if you take a bit of a C. elegans worm that has been trained to follow a light source to find food, then if you clone a worm from that cell, that cloned worm will know that same training. So there's something really interesting about how information is being embodied in the entirety of these 302 neurons. And that's, of course, very different from us. As I say, we've got 86 billion brain cells. And this does seem to lead to different kinds of profiles. So, for example, there's no known limit to human memory. All computers that exist in the world, we know how much information would take to fill them up. We've never found that with the human brain, because the way that it stores information isn't just by dumping it into files. It's reorganizing and changing around the information as it learns it. And there's no known limit on the number of languages that humans can speak. The limit, as with memory, actually seems to be time, the amount of time that you can devote to this. Humans are built, if you like, to speak multiple languages. And that's, again, resting on these very complex, enormous brains that we have. And one thing that we are bad at is thinking about the scale of magnitude. Human brains are not good at this. So just a final point to think about how very different your brain is from that C. elegans worms. The mathematician John Allen Paulos has said that if you change numbers into seconds and think about magnitude in terms of time, that makes a lot more sense to us. So if we think about the number of neurons as seconds, those 302 brain cells of C. elegans adds up to about 5 minutes, whereas your 86 billion brain cells ends up at 2,727 years. You've got one big, amazing brain. Make the best of it. Make the most of it. And final push for my book on the same topic. Thank you.